Hello and welcome to this Personal Communications Competence mini module. Just give me a second, I'll share the screen and then we can begin. So this Personal Communications Competency is on writing skills. Now writing is a very full brain activity. So perhaps first of all we need to look at what side of our brain is more dominant. So perhaps just for a few seconds you could make your fingers into a little triangle, look straight ahead of you, try and find something that's got a straight line, a side of a window, a picture frame, a light switch, and as you're looking at the light switch, find a line that goes down the middle of your triangle and then close one eye, close the other, and work out when you close the eye which one keeps the straight line more towards the centre of your triangle. And if you were suddenly to hear a noise next door, which ear would you put your hand to listen in? Or if you suddenly felt this urge to kick a football, which foot would you use? And each of those indicates, if you were mainly using your left sides, that you've probably got a right brain dominance, and the opposite, if you were usually using your right sides, you're probably left brain dominant. Because different hemispheres of our brains help us to do different things. They focus on different aspects, and that's the same when it comes to writing. So just to conclude on that, how we use our brains, I'm going to open up this slide for you, and when I do, I would like you to go through it, and I'd like you to say the colour that you see, not the word. I'll give you a minute or so to do that. So it should have gone something like this. Green, red, purple, yellow, purple, black, red, purple, green, black, red, yellow, green, purple, black, purple, red, green. Phew, I got it right. So what we've seen there is a little bit on which side of our brain we use, and there was just a little bit of right-left brain conflict, where the right side is trying to get you to say the colour and the left's insisting on reading the words. Because as I said, writing can be a whole brain activity. Now at the moment, Natura 2000 writing tends to be very factual and scientific, but it still needs to be well written and clear and understandable. A lot of technical writing is a left brain activity, using logic, detail, language and grammar and structure. Whereas creative writing, well, we tend to access the right side of our brain using imagination, fantasy, symbols, graphics, colours and imagery. So in order to compose a piece of writing usually requires us to use different parts of our brains, all the elements that we already have, even if through perhaps our education or our experience we have a tendency or a preference for a particular style. So before we get down to writing, maybe the first thing we need to think to ourselves is, do we actually really need some words? We all say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So consider before you actually start writing if an image is actually more appropriate than many long descriptive words. However, we do also need to choose our images and the words that go with them carefully in order to get our messages across. Remember too that the images that we're selecting need to also show the kind of activities and behaviours that you are inviting people to take part in, to reinforce the messages that you're giving about your Natura 2000 site. So please make sure that your images don't then contradict the rest of your messages. So maybe you could just take a moment to reflect on these pictures that you see before you and think what these images are saying to you. What comes to your mind to describe how you feel when you see these pictures? Give that a couple of moments just to have a look and have a think about what these pictures are saying to you. Because the images that you select, they're trying to evoke a feeling or some thoughts that you want to convey to your audience. But bearing in mind that they're bringing their own experience and feelings to these images too. Could be sense of being lost in this wilderness, or having an adventure, or just being in awe of the landscape, very peaceful nature of it, or the sense and the urge to discover it. Or coffee. Well, when I did this exercise a wee while ago, that was one of the words that someone used to describe how they felt about this picture. And what they told me was that this image was very much similar to one that was used in a very famous coffee advert in their country. So whenever they see a picture of blue mountains like this, it makes them think of coffee. So just be aware that the images you use and what it's saying to your audience might not be exactly what it is you were trying to evoke in the first place. Because the brain does process visuals 60,000 times faster than it does text. It takes 13 milliseconds for the brain to identify an image in front of it, and then another 100 milliseconds to process and make sense of that information. And I heard that most of the group who are following these modules are visual learners. So you prefer to learn by seeing, by using maps and diagrams, posters and displays. Because people retain 80% of what they see, 20% of what they read, and 10% of what they hear. So any good communications should really use a combination of all of these in order to try and touch on as many people as possible to get the information that you're trying to present to them. Because we're hardwired to thrive on visual context. Remember back in module 1, we talked about the different forms of communications, and in fact we've been communicating with signs and symbols and drawings for thousands of years. The Lascaux drawings found in the caves in France of animals on the walls. We've been doing that for a very long time. And research has found that the best way to capture and hold people's attention using visuals is to use contrasting graphics and images. And also perhaps, if possible, to use a little bit of movement, because the eye is drawn to movement. And remember, we mentioned something about that, or we heard about that through the videos of David J.P. Phillips. So using signs and images can be a good thing, but of course the image itself has to be clear and make sure that it's presenting the correct information. Because even images need to be clear. They can't be conflicting and confusing and certainly overloaded with information. They need to have a coherent message through them, through the use of the graphic and the images. There are some tips and best practices to think about when using diagrams, infographics, visuals. Most of you turned out to be visual learners. Well, you're in good company. 60% of people usually are. And you probably notice in social media and in other forms the widespread use of infographics to explain processes and offer high-level summaries of information that can be quite dense to try and explain in many, many words. But of course, make sure that the diagrams themselves are visually consistent. As I said, our brains are trying to make sense of the world around about us, and they're looking for patterns and to try and anticipate the conclusion to something. So be consistent with your formatting, your use of fonts, shapes and colours, particularly when you're trying to present different aspects of the information in your diagram. Be consistent in the shapes and the colours and the fonts that you're using. It's much easier for the reader to be engaged in the logic of the diagram that you're presenting. Remember that diagrams are there to explain that valuable information, so don't then overload your diagrams with many words too. The image should do the explaining for you. So use as few words as possible. Our brains are built for stimulation, but too much and they'll just close down. And it takes away from the purpose of your communication and making it therefore harder for people to understand your diagram or your graphic or what it is you're trying to say. As I said earlier, animation can really connect with people. The average attention span of a human is about 8 seconds. So if we can see a bit of movement, it helps people to focus on that piece of information that you are trying to present to them. And make sure too that your diagram is also there to tell a story. It needs to have a logical flow and be coherent. and be easy for people to understand what it is you're trying to tell them. So just a few tips there on the use of diagrams before we even get on to writing. Because with all communication, it is important to first of all understand who is your audience. Audience before content, ABC. So remember to identify to whom is this piece of writing intended. Is it a funding body? Is it the general public, or is it one of your stakeholder groups? Because the same principles of good practice apply in written communication as it did in face-to-face as in presentation. But when we're thinking especially about writing, again, what is the message that you're trying to convey? And be very clear in producing that message. Don't just write stream of consciousness stuff, anything that comes out of your head, and put it on paper. It still needs to be clear to the audience. But fundamentally, any good writing has to make sure that this grammar, the spelling, and the punctuation are to a very high standard. Because otherwise, misunderstanding will definitely be at the forefront of your writing as opposed to understanding. So having identified your audience and your message, what is the right media or channel for that writing to be put into? Who's going to read it? How long does the message need to be? What media shall I use? Should we be putting fire safety messages through a text? A few years ago, I probably would have said no. These days, I'm slightly less certain. That may very well work in some situations since everybody's on their smartphones now. So ABC still as important with written communications as it is with all other forms of communication, but get the basics right first. So when considering communication, a Natura 2000 manager may concentrate on the spoken and the personal communications, but in fact writing and writing well to express the vision and the goals of your Natura 2000 site are equally important. You might not need to be a poet or a prize-winning author, but having an understanding of the different written materials that you need and how to improve them is a really much needed and important skill. Remember, what you write is often the first point of contact with many people. It's your front window of your site, your books, your leaflets, your brochures, your website. And if you remember also back in module 1, we talked about implicit personality theory, where people are making assumptions based on your appearance. Well, I think your written appearance is also part of that. And if they come across bad writing or poorly structured writing or just dense, obscure writing, then it doesn't really invite them into what it is you want to tell them. Can undermine all your good verbal and presentation communications if you've written something very badly. So think about an average working day from the moment you get up to when you go back to bed, and think of everything that you've written throughout that day, from the smallest of notes to the many emails, the tweets, the letters, funding applications, and even complex scientific reports or legal papers. Because everything we write is probably on a spectrum from something very scientific and technical through to perhaps something much more creative. Laws, regulations, contracts, scientific papers are perhaps much more structured and formal in their writing, and poetry and artwork might indeed be at the other end. But what we do as protected area managers in Natura 2000 sites is write something that's called factually creative or creative non-fiction. And actually, you'll be pleased to hear, it's actually very difficult. It's quite a difficult genre of writing to master. It brings together the literary styles of the creative aspects and brings those techniques to present factually accurate narratives about real facts and figures and things that are on our sites. So that's the area that I think for our writing skills that we particularly need to focus on, although I will be dealing with scientific and technical writing and creative writing in other mini modules. So let's look at what else might be on the spectrum. Now, why might I have put funding applications into factually creative? Well, if ever you've tried to squeeze as few words as possible into those structured paragraphs that they often give you in a funding application, then I think that's quite a creative process to do that. Trail guides. Again, we're having to describe something that's real in an accurate way, but in an entertaining and informative and inviting way for the reader to engage with our site on our trails. And then there's everything else in between, from what we write on our website, our leaflets, our brochures, our books, our social media, all of which needs to have some structure and content to it. And of course, really moving into the creative side is when we're talking about our visitor centre exhibitions, our interpretation panels, where really we are trying to evoke a sense of place and a sense of connectivity to that place through what it is we're seeing through our writing. So, as we did with our presentation skills and with other aspects, we talked about three aspects, and it's the same with writing. There are three basic essentials of good writing, and they are content. Know what you are writing about. Be correct in your information. Don't make wild, unsubstantiated claims. Especially also when you're writing in an international audience, where the subtle differences in meaning can cause a lot of misunderstandings. So it is important to be accurate with the content that you're writing about. The structure, the way in which that content is presented. Now, of course, in a very scientific and technical writing, the structure is often dictated to you. There are accepted structures in legal writing and contract writing that you can't really stray from. However, for most other types of writings, the writer can use different structures and orders to sequence the information. So even in something like a funding application, although you might have a space to write a particular piece of information, how you structure that information in there, can make that information more clear and more coherent to the reader. And when we move into even more creative forms of writing, we can use different structures, or even in things like press releases, we could use, for example, a time sequence where we're talking about something that's happening in the future, something in the present, and something in the past. And we can vary those orders. They don't necessarily have to be past, present, future. We can, play around with that in order to create interest in the reader. We could also use geography. We could talk about something that's happening very local and relate that to a European or to a global situation, and vice versa. So again, we can think about using and applying different structures to the information in a creative way that makes it interesting and engaging to the reader. And remember, when we are talking about technical writing, we nearly always would be using the passive voice. So when we're thinking about style in the technical sense, again, you have very little room for manoeuvre there, but when you're writing in a factually creative way, or indeed a very creative way, yeah, you could go crazy with your style. You could decide to write it in the first person, or write it from the perspective of a plant, an animal, a rock, a fantasy person. So there are different ways of creating interest through style. But essentially, the three things that you need to be thinking about for any piece of writing, whether it's a technical piece of writing or a creative piece of writing, is the content, the structure, and the style. As I just mentioned there are different rules and guidelines for both technical writing and for creative writing, and I will deal with both of these later on. But I'd like to add, in addition to those three fundamentals, 5 simple tests that your writing is good and accessible and interesting for the reader. It needs to have clarity. Know what it is you want to say, and say it clearly and say it well. When we speak, we tend to speak in a very convoluted and complex way with qualifications and adorning phrases, and it's usually quite grammatically incorrect, but it conforms to the way that the mind listens and takes in information. There's also tone, emphasis, body language, facial expressions, all of those things that we talked about when we're learning about non-verbal communications, which aids the understanding when someone is listening to you. All of that is lost in writing. The mind reads in a very different way to understand. It needs simple, straightforward sentences. It needs clarity. So never write as you would speak. Brevity. Less is always more. Simplicity. Try to avoid jargon, buzzwords and long sentences, and certainly overly technical and scientific language, unless you're speaking to very overly technical and scientific people. But if you're speaking to anyone else, try and find a more simpler way of explaining those scientific and technical terms. Now, I've added a couple of extra tests of good writing onto those top 3. And that would be humanity. What I mean by that is it relatable to your audience? Is there a human aspect to this writing that they can relate to? It doesn't necessarily therefore have to be in the first person, but they have to be able to connect with what it is you're writing about. And that brings me to authenticity. Any good writing will always be made better when you really believe, you put some passion into what you're writing, and that needn't necessarily be very emotive writing, but it can still come across in a very positive and constructive way, even in a technical written piece of work. A few other things that I just want to mention here that again, very important just to bear in mind. Be careful of plagiarizing. Do not copy from elsewhere, and that means copying and pasting from bits of the website, from blogs and others. These are all copyrighted information. If you do want to do that, obviously cite or reference other people's work, and you may have noticed in my presentations I have put citations onto the screens where I have taken information from somebody else's website. But with that, you could use quotes. When you feel you don't have the words to express something well enough, there are plenty more wise people out there with some fantastic turns of phrases than I think we will ever be able to come up with. And that's something I like to do for Europark, and you'll see here on the slide I've used a famous quote by Victor Hugo. It's a sad matter to think that nature speaks and that the human race does not listen. And so, you know, there are some very nice poetic quotes out there. I think it's useful to sprinkle them into your into the kinds of things that you're writing. Again, as long as you cite and reference them properly. So we just want to again cover a little bit about the difference between technical and creative writing. I'd like to take a look at this very, very famous, world famous quotation here. And this would be that quotation written in a technical style. A political organisation administered via the populace, intended for the employment of the general community on behalf of each and every one of the citizens of the nation. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? No, it's quite dense. It has a big long sentence in it. It's quite technically written. The better known and more creative version of this quotation is government of the people, by the people, for the people. Now, does that statement meet our 5 tests of good writing? It has clarity, it has brevity, it has simplicity, it has humanity, and it certainly is authentic, because it's the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. A very, very famous speech. Please look it up if you're not familiar with it. And there you see the difference between something that's written in a very technical style and something that's written in a very creative style. And I imagine that most of you relate more to that creative version. So just to summarise, our Natura 2000 material does tend to be quite technical and quite obscure. And that's only relevant if you're writing for very technical and very obscure people. But in fact, we tend to not do that, except in very exceptional situations. So we do need to be thinking about making our writing more clear and accessible for people. Use visuals, but use good visuals where they're appropriate. Your reader and your reader's brain will thank you for it. Writing is a skill, and it's something that you can learn through practice. One of the best ways to improve your writing is to read, and to read different forms of writing. And that will certainly inspire you and give you ideas and show you different structures and different ways of presenting information. So, you know, invest in some new books. Words are money. And I'm sure those of you who are managers of Natura 2000 sites or Those of you who have managers, your managers will tell you that. It takes money for someone to write words, it takes money to read words, it takes money to print words, and it takes money to translate words. So brevity is indeed your friend, and brevity will save you money too. I've mentioned before about the longness of sentences. Yeah, if you're getting to the point where you're using a third comma or a fourth comma in a very long sentence, you need to be thinking to yourself, this should really be broken down into shorter sentences. The brain likes short sentences. And certainly if you're to read your work out loud and you can't breathe, then your sentence definitely is too long. The first draft of your writing is rarely the best one. Aim for about the third one, the time you've done some editing and some modifications. And if it is possible, please try and get someone else to read your work. They will always see something that you haven't seen, or will ask you questions about understanding of something that seemed perfectly obvious to you, but perhaps hasn't come across as well in your writing as you thought it would do. So I hope that's been of interest and of some use to you, and happy writing. I look forward to our next mini module. Bye-bye for now.